You're standing on a causeway, stone lions on either side, snarling, worn smooth by 8 centuries of monsoon rain. Ahead of you, 5 towers rise out of the morning mist, shaped like lotus buds about to open. Behind you, somewhere beyond the tree line, a city of perhaps 750,000 people, bigger than London would be for another 500 years. This is the morning of an empire at its absolute peak. Within 150 years, it will be empty. Not conquered in a single battle, not erased in a single fire, something slower, something almost nobody walking that causeway that morning would have believed possible. And the strangest part is this: the very thing that made the city a wonder of the medieval world is the same thing that killed it. This is the story of Angkor. Picture the Khmer Empire at its height, sometime around the year 1200. You are not yet at the temple itself. You are still miles out, moving through what European visitors centuries later would assume was empty jungle. It was not empty. It was a city. Not a city in the way you imagine a city. No single dense core, no obvious edge, but a sprawling, low-density urban landscape stretching across roughly 1,000 square kilometers, threaded with canals, reservoirs, rice paddies, and wooden houses on stilts. The whole thing organized around water, with an obsessiveness that modern engineers still study. Researchers using airborne laser scanning in the 2010s confirmed what earlier scholars had only guessed at. Angkor was, by some measures, the largest pre-industrial urban settlement on Earth. At the center of it sat the Temple Mountain itself, Angkor Wat, completed under King Suryavarman II around 1150, dedicated first to the Hindu god Vishnu. Its moat alone is 190 meters wide, wrapping the temple complex in a perfect rectangle, and the entire structure was built using an estimated 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks, some quarried from a mountain 40 kilometers away and floated down a canal network on rafts. Stop and feel the scale of that for a second. 40 kilometers, no trucks, no cranes, just river current, rope, and the backs of an enormous, coordinated labor force. A Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan arrived at the Khmer capital in August of 1296, sent by the Yuan court, and stayed for about a year. He is the human thread running through this story, because he is also one of the only outside eyewitnesses history left us. Zhou Daguan wrote a memoir afterward, The Customs of Cambodia, and it is astonishingly specific, the kind of document historians treasure, precisely because it does not flatter anyone. He described the king, Indravarman III by that point, appearing in public covered in gold ornaments, holding a golden sword, and he described the layout of the royal palace with its gilded roof tiles. He recorded the markets, where women did most of the trading, the floating houses on the great lake of Tonle Sap, and the sheer density of canals used to move rice, fish, and timber. He noted the heat, the rain that fell with such force in the wet season that streets became rivers within an hour, and the smell of drying fish hung along the waterways. He was, by his own account, both impressed and unsettled. He found the Khmer court magnificent, and also recorded, bluntly, things he disapproved of, including practices around slavery and concubinage that he considered beneath Chinese civilization. Historians today treat his account with care. He was an outsider with his own biases, and some of his claims cannot be independently verified. But where archaeology has been able to test his record, building layouts, irrigation features, court ritual, Zhou Daguan checks out again and again. What sustained all of this, the temples, the population, the army, was rice. And what sustained the rice was water, engineered on a scale almost nobody else attempted before the modern era. The Khmer built enormous reservoirs called barais. The West Baray alone measured roughly 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, an artificial lake dug entirely by hand, designed to store monsoon rainfall and release it through a network of canals during the dry months. Multiple harvests a year were possible because of this system. It is the reason Angkor could feed a population that size in one place, something almost no other society of that era achieved. The Barets were not just farming infrastructure either. They carried deep religious meaning, representing the cosmic ocean surrounding Mount Meru, the home of the gods in Hindu cosmology that Angkor Wat itself was built to mirror in stone. Function and faith, water and worship, were the same system. Remember that. It matters later. By the early 1200s, Under King Jayavarman VII, the empire reached its farthest extent, controlling territory stretching across much of what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Jayavarman VII converted the state religion toward Mahayana Buddhism, built the city of Angkor Thom with its four-faced towers at the Bayon Temple, each face wearing the same enigmatic half-smile, and constructed hospitals and rest houses along the empire's roads, inscriptions recording 102 hospitals built in his reign alone. This was a civilization that believed, with total confidence, that it would last forever. It did not. The forces that would unmake Angkor did not arrive as an invading horde. They arrived as small, almost invisible failures stacking on top of each other across 2 centuries, and the people living through them mostly could not see the pattern, because no one lives long enough to watch a slow collapse unfold from beginning to end. The first failure was religious and political. Sometime in the 13th century, Theravada Buddhism, a simpler, more austere, more individually focused tradition than the elaborate Hindu-Buddhist god-king cult that justified Angkor's monarchy, began spreading through the population, likely carried in part by trade and contact with Sri Lanka and Sukhothai. This mattered enormously because the entire ideological foundation of Angkorian kingship rested on the idea that the king was a Devaraja, a god-king, whose temple building and water management projects were literally cosmic acts maintaining order in the universe. Theravada Buddhism offered ordinary people a path to merit and salvation that did not require an enormous state-sponsored temple economy at all. Slowly, the labor, wealth, and devotion that once flowed automatically toward god-king temple projects had somewhere else to go. The second failure was climatic, and modern science can now see it where Zhou Daguan could not. Tree ring records taken from centuries-old cypress trees in Vietnam, published by climate scientists in the 2010s, reveal that the region experienced severe multi-decade megadroughts during the 1300s and 1400s, interrupted by sudden, violent monsoon flooding. Some scholars argue this pattern was the single most damaging blow to Angkor's hydraulic system. The canals and barrages were engineered for a relatively stable climate regime, and they could not absorb decades of alternating drought and flood. Sediment cores taken from the moat of Angkor Wat itself show evidence of erosion and silting consistent with this period of climate instability. The very system that had made Angkor possible, total water control, on a scale no rival kingdom could match, became a liability the moment the climate stopped cooperating in predictable ways. A system built for abundance had no flexibility for scarcity. The third failure was military and political pressure from the West. A new Thai kingdom, Ayutthaya, founded around 1351 along the Chao Phraya River, grew rapidly in power, absorbing smaller Thai principalities and pressing directly against Khmer territory. Ayutthaya fought repeated wars with Angkor across the late 1300s and into the 1400s, and each war drained Khmer manpower, treasure, and, critically, the labor needed to maintain the canals and reservoirs that the entire civilization depended on. Maintenance is invisible work. Nobody writes triumphant inscriptions about desilting a canal. And so, year after year, less of it happened. A farmer working a paddy near the eastern Baray in this period. The inscriptions never name people like him, so historians sometimes call such a figure a composite, a rice grower we might call Bora, standing in for thousands whose names no stone preserved, would not have experienced the decline of Angkor as a single event. He would have experienced a drought year where the reservoir ran low, then a flood year that breached an embankment nobody had repaired, then conscription, his sons taken for the wars against Ayutthaya. Each hardship looked local, survivable, ordinary. The pattern only becomes visible 800 years later, from the outside, with satellite data and tree rings and the cold arithmetic of decline. By the early 1400s, the warning signs were everywhere for anyone positioned to see the whole picture. Fewer hospitals founded, fewer new temples, repeated wars draining the same overstretched population, a hydraulic network slowly losing its capacity to buffer against the climate's increasing volatility. Almost nobody positioned to see the whole picture existed. That is the nature of dramatic irony in real history. The people closest to the crisis are usually the least able to perceive its shape. Then, in the year 1431, the breaking point arrived, and it arrived as an army. The Ayutthayan king Boromaracha II led a major offensive against Angkor that year, following decades of escalating conflict between the two kingdoms. Thai chronicles, later compiled royal annals, which historians treat as valuable but not infallible, since they were written generations after events to glorify the Ayutthayan dynasty, describe a prolonged siege of the Khmer capital. Some accounts describe the siege lasting many months, the city's defenders weakened by the very infrastructure failures that had been accumulating for 100 years. An army cannot easily withstand a long siege when its food-producing hinterland is already strained by drought and decades of war. Cambodian chronicles, compiled even later and colored by their own political purposes, add further detail, though historians caution that exact casualty figures and precise dates in both traditions should be treated as approximate rather than precise. What is reasonably well established, cross-referenced through archaeology and multiple chronicle traditions, is this. Angkor fell to Ayutthayan forces, the city was looted, and a significant portion of the population, and crucially, a portion of the skilled bureaucratic and religious elite who knew how to operate the hydraulic system, organize labor for canal maintenance, and run the temple state administration, was reportedly taken back to Ayutthaya, including, by some traditional accounts, members of the royal family and court. Picture the specific human moment in that, not just buildings burning, but a society's institutional memory being physically marched out of the city in chains. Knowledge does not survive in stone. It survives in living people who know how a sluice gate works, who remembers which canal silts up fastest, who can read the old administrative inscriptions. When you remove enough of those people from a place, you don't just lose a battle, you lose the operating manual for an entire civilization's relationship with its own land. The Khmer court did not vanish after 1431. It survived, but it relocated, first toward Basan, later establishing a longer-term capital near present-day Phnom Penh, closer to the Mekong and the lucrative river trade routes that increasingly mattered more than the inland rice and temple economy that Angkor represented. Some royal ceremonies and limited occupation likely continued at Angkor for some additional years afterward. The site was never instantaneously abandoned in a single dramatic exodus, despite how the story is often simplified. But the center of political, economic, and religious gravity had permanently shifted away from the city that had once held 750,000 people. And the jungle began to do what jungles do. Without thousands of laborers constantly desilting canals, repairing embankments, and clearing drainage channels, the hydraulic system that had kept Angkor alive for half a millennium began silting up within a single generation. Without that water control, large-scale multi-harvest rice agriculture became impossible at the old scale. Without the population that rice had fed, there was no labor to maintain the temples. Without maintenance, the temples, built from sandstone, a relatively soft stone vulnerable to tropical humidity, root systems, and monsoon erosion, began to crumble at the edges, stone by stone, vine by vine. Strangler fig and silk cotton trees, whose seeds had likely been carried by birds onto temple roofs for centuries already, found that nobody was clearing them anymore, and their roots began the long, patient work of prying apart stone blocks that had stood since Suryavarman II's reign. This did not happen overnight. It happened across roughly 4 centuries, a slow folding of one of the largest cities on Earth back into the forest it had been carved out of. Local Khmer communities never fully forgot Angkor Wat itself. Theravada Buddhist monks maintained a presence at the temple complex continuously, even as the surrounding city dissolved into farmland and forest, and Khmer kings occasionally still visited or made repairs to Angkor Wat specifically across the following centuries, treating it as a sacred site even after it ceased to be a capital. What outsiders eventually discovered was never lost to everyone. It was lost to the wider world. That rediscovery, for Western audiences, is usually credited to a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot, who arrived at Angkor Wat in January 1860 while traveling through the region collecting specimens. Mouhot wrote letters home describing the temple in language of pure astonishment, comparing it favorably to the grandest monuments of Greece and Rome, and his account, published posthumously in 1864 after his death from fever in Laos, captured European imagination and triggered decades of French colonial-era archaeological expeditions. It is worth being precise here because the popular telling of this story often gets it wrong. Muhat did not discover Angkor in any meaningful sense. Cambodian people had lived alongside it, worshipped at it, and recorded it in their own chronicles for 400 years. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries had written about it as early as the 1500s and 1600s. What Muhat did was introduce it, dramatically and effectively, to a European public that had never heard of it, and in doing so, he accidentally helped cement a colonial-era myth, the myth of a lost city, abandoned and mysterious, that obscured the continuous Khmer relationship with the site that had never actually broken. The aftermath of Angkor's collapse reshaped Southeast Asia's entire balance of power. Ayutthaya rose to become the dominant force in the region for the next 4 centuries, until the Burmese sacked it in turn in 1767, a reminder that no temple state, however magnificent, escapes the same forces that brought down the one before it. The Khmer kingdom that survived Angkor's fall persisted, smaller, more vulnerable, increasingly squeezed between Thai and Vietnamese power, a dynamic that would echo into French colonization in the 1860s and, much later, into the catastrophic violence of the 20th century. The line between the empire that built 10 million sandstone blocks and the country navigating its survival between far larger neighbors today is a direct, traceable one. Zhou Daguan, the Chinese envoy, returned home to Yuan, China in 1297 with his manuscript, and for over 500 years almost nobody outside a narrow circle of scholars read it carefully. It survived quietly in Chinese archives, while the city it described slowly disappeared into the forest he had walked through as a living, breathing capital. When historians and archaeologists finally cross-referenced his account against the ruins in the 20th century, his descriptions of palace layout, court ritual, and city organization matched the physical evidence with startling accuracy. A single eyewitness, writing for an audience that mostly ignored him, turning out centuries later to be one of the most reliable sources humanity has for understanding how Angkor actually functioned while it was alive. Here is the part of this story that should unsettle you a little, because it is not really about the 13th century at all. Angkor did not fall to a single dramatic catastrophe. It fell because an enormously sophisticated, enormously successful system, built for a climate, a population pattern, and a set of political assumptions that all seemed permanent, turned out to have no flexibility once those conditions shifted even modestly. The berets that once represented divine cosmic order became, when the rains stopped behaving the way 9 generations of engineers had assumed they would, a fixed and brittle system in a world that had quietly become unpredictable. Modern climate researchers studying ancient megadroughts have explicitly pointed to Angkor as a case study in what happens when complex infrastructure, optimized for stability, meets sustained climate volatility it was never designed to absorb. Cities today depend on power grids, water systems, and supply chains, every bit as interconnected and every bit as optimized for the climate of the last century rather than the climate of the next one. Angkor's lesson was never really about Cambodia. It was about what happens to any system, anywhere, that mistakes a long run of good years for a permanent law of nature. You can stand on that same causeway today. The lions still snarl, smoother now. Tour buses idle, where ox carts once carried sandstone blocks from 40 kilometers away. Tree roots the size of a man's torso still grip the stones of Ta Prohm exactly the way they did when 19th century explorers first photographed them, deliberately left unrestored so visitors can see what 4 centuries of silence does to even the most confident civilization ever built. Bora the farmer, if he ever existed exactly as we've described him, has no grave anyone can point to, no inscription bearing his name. But the rice paddies near Angkor are still farmed today, by his descendants in every sense that matters, using water systems that, in some places, still trace the outline of canals his hands may once have helped maintain. The empire that built 10 million stones to make a mountain for its gods could not, in the end, outlast a few decades of unreliable rain. The forest took 400 years to finish what the drought started, and it never once needed to hurry.